Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Richard Wilson. I'm a professor of law and anthropology here at the University of Connecticut. I'd like to just start by leading us all, I think, in expressing my sincere admiration for Michael Lynch and Brendan Kane and the whole team here at the Humanities Institute for what they've achieved over the last 4 years. Even though they had a lot of money, they still did an incredibly good job with it and created, I think, what we all agree to be a remarkably lively set of intellectual conversations about really important topics that they were incredibly prescient to see emerging before they emerged quite in the full-blown glory that they've been over the last couple of years. So sincere admiration to you. I see the bags under Brendan's eyes and the general look of exhaustion, but they have just achieved so much at so many different levels intellectually, and also the community engagement and the projecting and the Times op-eds and all those amazing things. So we have a very exciting day today. I'm going to introduce the panelists very briefly. You have their full bios in here, and I'm just going to gloss them. But we'll have 3 talks in succession. They'll be 20 minutes each. I'll sit here and hold up cards to keep everyone on time. And then we'll have conversation afterwards, so please hold your thoughts to the end. We'll start with a talk called Changing Attitudes in Public Discourse by, and please correct me if I butcher your names, which I may.
I'm used to.
Alessandra Tanesini is professor of philosophy at Cardiff University, the author of An Introduction to Feminist Epistemologies and Wittgenstein, A Feminist Interpretation, and many articles in epistemology, feminist philosophy, the philosophy of mind and language, and Nietzsche. She'll be joined by Gregory Maio, who is professor and head of Department of Psychology at the University of Bath, although they say Bath. He's examined diverse topics in social psychology, and including ESRC-funded topics on values, prejudice, methods to increase humility and debate, the role of values in close relationships, family relationships. That's where it's really hard, isn't it? Humility around the Thanksgiving or Christmas or Seder table. That's when I think we're all truly challenged. It's fine doing it in the classroom, but there's another story. Talk 2 will be Benjamin Meagher. Is that correct?
Meagher.
Meagher?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Irish pronunciation.
That's right.
Excellent. Okay, and he is currently visiting assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Hope College, and previously a postdoc in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Baylor, and he's taught in the psychology department at Franklin and Marshall College, and he conducts research on environment, social, and personality psychology. He'll be talking about collective intellectual humility, investigating the role of intellectual humility during cooperative and contentious group interaction. And our final talk will be by Philip Fernbach, who is assistant professor of marketing in the Leeds School of Business. We have a lot of Brits today, don't we?
It's not in Britain.
Sorry?
Different Leeds school.
Different Leeds.
University of Colorado.
Oh, it's in Colorado. Okay, right. Okay, that could be wrong. I wondered if it was like a Brexit humility thing. It's just like an emerging consensus that humility was the best path forward. It's been that way for a while. Okay. Philip's research is published in outlets such as the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Management Science, and the Journal of Consumer Research, and he's been profiled in media outlets like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review, and his talk is The Cognitive Basis of Extremism. So we'll start first with Alessandra and Gregory.
Thank you. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to say a few general things about the philosophical part of the project and what the project aimed to do in general. And then Greg will report on the experimental results. So we are a very interdisciplinary team, and in fact it consists of 3 disciplines. Linguistics, more specifically multimodal and conversational analysis, philosophy, and social psychology. The linguists and the philosophers were Cardiff, the social psychologists were Bath. And then there was Ian as consultant, who is based in Nottingham, who is also a philosopher. So, what we were trying to do, broadly speaking, was try to understand the psychological underpinnings of humility, arrogance, and servility. And when I say psychological underpinnings, to me it actually matters, but because what I'm interested in is not a conceptual analysis of humility. What I'm interested in is what, in reality, what are the empirical properties that are causally responsible for the range of dispositions, behaviors, and so on and so forth that we label humility. And so what we were interested in is understand those underpinnings and understand how these virtue and vices manifest themselves in debate. So we were interested in the linguistic and paralinguistic expressions, manifestations of humility, servility, and arrogance. And that's why we had the three disciplines, right? So we were trying to draw from the resources of virtue epistemology to understand what virtues and vices are, from the resources of psychology to understand what is psychologically underpinning these virtue and vices, and from conversational analysis in order to provide a sort of very focused description and evaluation of the expressions of these virtues and vices in debate, and the three teams. And as I say, the idea was to explore face-to-face debates. And we are very grateful, as Greg was saying, to UConn and John Templeton Foundation for funding this project, because as Greg testifies, this is old-fashioned social psychology, and it's really difficult to get it funded. And there's nothing wrong with being old-fashioned, right? And sometimes old-fashioned is good. And so we are very grateful that you have allowed us to explore something that is as complicated as this. And the final broad aim we were trying to achieve is to sort of explore an intervention for the promotion of humility. And as Greg is going to explain, that intervention is value affirmation, and he will talk more about that. So broadly speaking, if that's the sort of general aims, the specific questions where are these underpinnings attitudes? And the reason why that was the question is because I've written on that. And I've written it as an hypothesis, right? You know, when philosophers write stuff that has empirical import, you sort of say, please help me, you know, am I right here? There are good reasons to believe that this might be right. And so we were going to try to explore what it means to say that these traits are underpinned by attitudes, and to try to sort of test that hypothesis, if possible. We were going to try to understand which linguistic and paralinguistic, and by paralinguistic, although I'm not a linguist, I think I know what they mean. What they mean is things like head nods, and things like you know, tone and so on. Those things, aspects of behavior, they are sort of related to, they convey meaning, right? But are not linguistic in the strict sense of the term. And we were going to try to understand which behaviors are expressive of humility, arrogance, and servility. Are there any linguists in the room? Right. So my colleague, who is the linguist who does this, says that this is so counter-disciplinary because linguists do not like moral terminology. They try to expunge any thick ethical term from anything they talk about. So in many ways, we were going, you know, we were doing old-fashioned social psychology and like devil-born conversational analysis, because we were trying to bring ethics into back into conversational analysis. But linguists like to be objective, so we don't talk about emphasis. So that's what we were trying to do. And then the third question was, can self-affirmation increase humility? How am I doing for time?
You're doing very well.
Because I only got 10 minutes because
You've done 5.
Okay. So let me give you a sense of the activities to date. We have organized 2 interdisciplinary workshops in Cardiff and in Bath. The one in Cardiff was mostly between philosophers and conversational analysts to try to understand how to conceptualize humility, servility, and arrogance in linguistic terms. The one in Bath was mostly social psychologists trying to understand humility and arrogance in psychological terms. And we had a big international conference in Cardiff that has a bit of everybody. And we were talking mostly about arrogance and polarization. Many of the presentations for those workshops and for the conference are on our website. We sort of recorded all the talks, and whenever we got the permission, we didn't always get permission because some of the data was unpublished and confidential and people prefer not to be recorded. But when people agreed to be recorded, all the podcasts are there. We had, and still do, have a blog called Open for Debate, which I like. I think it's a great time. Anyway, as published since May 2017, fortnightly, tons of people in this room have actually written for it. Paul has written, Heather, Michael, Greg, lots of people have. And if you have, Lani, and if you haven't, please do in future, because we're going to try to keep it up, Charlie as well. We're going to try to keep it alive. And so far, we have given numerous presentations, written numerous posts, articles, books, and so on and so forth. Right, so I'm going to be super quick because I've already covered some of that stuff. So basically, what I think was really innovative about the project was that it was trying to make the case that we should try to understand virtues, character virtues and vices in terms of attitudes. And that is, the philosophers here will confirm, until recently it wasn't the common view. The common view was that virtues and vices are dispositions, they are dispositional traits. Whereas the attitudes are not trait-like, they are mental state-like. And the attempt was to say, look, there are conceptual and empirical reasons to think that this is a promising venue. Not because the concept of humility or the concept of arrogance, if you give a conceptual analysis, it turns out to be an attitude, but because attitudes have the sort of features that you would expect of the mental states that are ultimately responsible for the dispositions that we use to label these virtues and vices. And one of the reasons, and then I'll move on, why I think it's very useful, is because people can behave arrogantly, more or less. People can be arrogant about some features of the self, but not others. And people can be behaving arrogantly in some situations, but not others. And I think there is a real difference between arrogant behavior and being arrogant. You can behave arrogantly out of a strategy design or because you are under stress without being arrogant, right? And you can, like, I'm arrogant about certain things about me. I think I'm smart. I'm arrogant about that. It's not a good trait. But I'm not arrogant about other things about myself. I mean, you know, there are some things I'm really, really bad at. I'm like not very good at sort of getting the vibe of a room, so I sort of come up with the wrong thing. Yeah, so you sort of, you know, you can be arrogant about some things and not others. And and attitudes, because they are object, right? You are directly an object, can have those varieties. So you can be arrogant have an arrogant attitude about that object, but not that other one. And attitudes can come in degree, where the degree is strength, right? And so you can be more or less arrogant depending on how strong your attitude is, right? And also, attitudes can, if they are not strong, be really impacted by situational factors, right? And so they have got those properties that make it ideal. So I am in 10 minutes, so I just have to say, can you read that slide? Yes? So that's the framework that the linguists came up with. It's called DEC, which is dominant and engagement and conviction. That slide only has the engagement and conviction. And we are trying to outline the behaviors that are characteristic of arrogance, right? So the arrogant does not engage with what others are saying, is low in affiliation. So it does not, when other people speak, is low in engagement with them in a way that is affiliative, that gives a sense that you're following. You don't necessarily agree, but you're following what they're saying in a way that is supportive, right? So the arrogant person is low in affiliation and high in unaffiliated disagreement, like you're an idiot. Okay? And it's a high in self-certainty, so epistemic boosting, and low in epistemic edging, low in saying, well, maybe, perhaps. So that's arrogance. This is humility, right? So the humble person will be high in affiliate, agree or disagree. So even when they disagree in a way that is not undermining of the speaker, but supportive. And will be low in epistemic boosting, which is certain, everybody knows. And high in epistemic edging, which is will be careful in what they say. So I might be wrong. And the servile person is engaging, but basically agreeing in a servile manner. And will be low in epistemic boosting. So will express low certainty of their own convictions. So I'll stop there. If there are more questions, we'll take them later, and Greg will talk about the results.
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me at the back? You all right? Yeah, good. So I have about 8 minutes, so I'll skip to the chase to describe the experiment that we did. This way. So what we were looking at, as Alessandra indicated, is the idea that intellectual humility is an attitude. And one thing that I found really exciting about Alessandra's framework is it points directly to attitude function. The notion that we're interested in is attitudes that have the capability or the purpose of trying to expand our knowledge on particular issues. So it's not about defense of the ego, it's not about social adjustment, it's about really trying to achieve a better sense of correctness. Now, early in my career, I was very interested in attitude function, did a number of studies on it, but eventually moved away from it because I found it so difficult to get to grips with empirically. So when this topic came along, and here we have this perspective that intellectual humility fulfills a knowledge expressive function, an interesting next question would be, how would we assess that in a dialogue or debate between people? Sorry, standing. And then related to that, if it is an attitude function, we should be able to alter it. So it's not just a stable trait across time. We should be able to intervene in some way to change the way in which this function is occurring. So in browsing the literature and thinking about ways to do this, the first technique we came across was self-affirmation. Self-affirmation is a common technique in social psychological literature that has been around for about 30 years now, where people have applied it in different contexts. But the commonality, and they've applied it in different ways, but its essential element involves affirming the self-concept in a way that increases people's sense of self-integrity. So what people do is they do a brief task which involves thinking about some positive attribute of the self, which in turn then increases what Claude Steele called a sense of self-integrity. Now, there are many ways in which you could do this. The most common technique that has been used is to employ this values affirmation task. There are different ways to do this as well. But for most of my career, I've been very interested in values, so I'm interested in this very common approach to self-affirmation, which is very simple. People complete a measure of values that are important to them, abstract ideals that are important guiding principles in their lives. After completing this measure, they pick the most important value or pair of values that is really important to them, and then they just write about why that value is important to them. So it's just meant to remind them of a belief or a very abstract ideal that they consider to be important. And in theory, this boosts a sense of self-integrity, and in a lot of research, what we find is that also increases openness to counter-attitudinal messages. So people are more receptive to attacks against their current point of view after completing a value affirmation paradigm. So a question for us is, do they show this kind of receptiveness in an interpersonal dialogue as opposed to just a one-shot counter-attitudinal persuasive message? Does it actually unplay in interactions? So we, in our experiment, gave people a measure of values in one condition, and here's their examples of values: forgiveness, an exciting life, independence. These are all taken from Schwartz's circular model of values, which has been looked at in over 80 nations around the world. So we use a contemporary measure, give it to people, ask them to identify the most important values from this list. Now, there are many ways in which self-affirmation can work. I don't think we pinned down one way in which it works. There's several ways in which it functions. But from our point of view, one aspect that's interesting is that the values affirmation task in past studies has increased feelings of love and connectedness, so very pro-social emotions. So we are interested in looking at that because it could be the case that, as this paper that I've highlighted up here has found, that this emotional effect is crucial for increasing the openness in a subsequent dialogue. So we included measures related to emotion. So in our study, we had 303 people we divided into 116 3- to 4-person groups, including a Confederate. And the Confederate was there to help ensure that we actually got a debate. So they completed various individual difference measures, and then they completed our manipulation, and then they have a dialogue in a group like this. The Confederate in this case is the young man second from your right, inset. This is a broader picture of the setup. Actually, center of that picture is Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex, who came to the lab to have a visit and a chat, which was fun. He's seeing on the screen there that picture of the group, and just the way the cameras were set up so that we could get audio and video of all of the participants in the debate. The debate was on the topic of tuition fees, incidentally, which is a very as we were doing this study, it's a very topical issue within the UK because they're very high tuition fees for the first time well, historically they're very high compared to the way they were free about 15 years ago. So it's still a very emotional issue for a lot of students, and for the community at large there's a lot of awareness of it and willingness to discuss it. So in the first stage, participants completed a variety of individual differences measures. I won't spend much time on them today. Then they completed measures after our values affirmation task of their current mood. So the values affirmation task, as I indicated, was very simple. They wrote about a value that was very important to them. In a control condition, they just wrote why they like or dislike 5 different beverages. So not meant to affirm any important ideal for them. Now, the next fun part was to look at the discussions they had on tuition fees afterwards. And as I said, the Confederates' role was to make sure they didn't agree easily. They were asked to evaluate 8 different arguments on the topic as to whether or not they were strong or weak arguments, and the Confederate was there to try to sow in some discord. What we looked at among the participants was the extent to which they showed high engagement, lower conviction, and lower civility, and treated that as an index of intellectual humility. Now, I'm not the linguist in the group, so I can't go into detail about how that was derived, but more or less what we did was we chatted with Alessandra, chatted with Chris, who's putting together all of the micro indices that we had, and then thought about how we would combine them in ways that would reflect this higher engagement, lower conviction, and lower servility. Then we looked at correlations between that measure, the dialogue within the groups, and the other individual differences measures. Now, I'm afraid you probably can't see the details on the left and the bottom there, but it doesn't matter. The general point in those light green boxes that you see is, if you look at them, there are a variety of sensible correlations between, for example, self-esteem and big five traits of neuroticism. There are sensible correlations in our sample between Liz Kumari-Mancuso's intellectual humility scale and measures like neuroticism and openness to persuasion. So those correlations generally pan out well. But the bottom row is the intellectual humility index from the debate. And that index didn't correlate with any of our individual differences measures in the analyses so far. We still have a bit more to do on that. So far, we haven't seen that. I'm running out of time, so all I say is, in brief, the emotions were affected exactly as Crocker and colleagues predicted. We saw more pro-social emotion following the values affirmation condition than after the control condition. Finally, the last comment is we see this a provocative effect. We still have more groups to finish coding, but at the moment we see a provocative effect of values affirmation in the predicted direction that it's increasing intellectual humility in the dialogue. There's a lot more to do. We need to code dominance within this framework. We also want to look at issues of discrepant self-esteem, whether or not people are high in explicit versus implicit self-esteem, and whether or not that moderates the effects. Finally, in future research, we'd like to look at the role of different values in self-affirmation. Does it make a difference which values people affirm? It's something that has actually been very tricky to get at in prior research and in this study as well. And finally, online debates. We looked at in-person debates. It's a very, I consider it an old-fashioned, really involved context, but it's also, it's a lab-based study. It has its own issues. We would love to see how this replicates online. Thank you.
So thanks for having me here today. I'm just sort of going to get right to it, I think. So, as we all know, really over the last several years, there's been a pretty dramatic increase in research on the topic of intellectual humility among psychologists, those of us here today. And I think that's motivated, right, by this belief that a lot of things that we think of as societal goods, science, education, democracy, at least conceptually depend on intellectual humility to function, right? And some of this empirical work has started to demonstrate that individual differences on intellectual humility are associated with things that are positive at the individual level. So things like being willing to hear other people's viewpoints, likelihood of attitude change following disagreement, potentially even ability to avoid certain types of cognitive biases. But despite this kind of focus on these individual level outcomes, I think there's been less work looking at how these things relate to group functioning, group outcomes, right? And I think that's a really important omission, because if we're sort of thinking about societal goods like science, education, democracy, these are fundamentally social things. And so I think it's important to get a sense of to what extent and in what context do groups actually benefit from having members high on these sorts of attributes. The challenge, though, so for folks interested in personality psychology and personality measurement, like myself, intellectual humility poses a number of unique challenges in terms of getting accurate assessment, right? So there's sort of been two strategies to try to assess intellectual humility. The main one that personality psychologists tend to focus on is self-report scales. So really over the last 3 or 4 years, several independent labs have produced their own version of self-report scales for intellectual humility. I was part of one. We had other people in the audience that were part of them. And they seem to show some reliability and some predictive validity. But at the same time, we have to be really cautious when we're talking about attributes that are as highly valenced as intellectual humility, thinking about really what we call construct validity. So if you look at this little graphic here, this is trying to express the fact that, people who are low on humility are really the exact type of people would expect to say that they're high on humility, right? So that's sort of the danger and the concern. And there is some evidence that these scales do tend to be positively associated with sort of socially desirable responding. So it's a real thing to worry about. But the alternative approach is really this thing called relational humility, where you're relying more on the impressions of others as the critical measurement of whether someone is high or low. And typically this employs this methodology, the social relations model, and a round-robin design. But basically what that means is that you have a group of people, and you have every member of the group give their impression of every other member of the group after some sort of interaction. And from that, you can compute something called the target effect, which is basically just telling you how each member is generally rated by other members of the group, right? So hopefully that avoids some of those social desirable issues. But even this approach has some concerns that you have to be thinking about and wary about. One of which is really just the question of whether groups are capable of agreeing about the members, whether they're high or low on this trait. If everyone's just sort of idiosyncratic, I think the person that agrees with me is humble, that's not going to be a very meaningful measurement either. So that's something to worry about. And the other thing to worry about, and kind of maybe even more fundamental than that, is really just the question of what information are people using to form impressions about others, right? Because we're really relying on lay judgments, and so potentially people use really weird criteria to make a decision about who's high or low on humility. Maybe, like I said, it's just sort of the people I like are the people that I think are humble. So that has concerns too. So really what my lab and I have been working on over the last few years is really thinking about the relationship between sort of peer assessments of humility and self-reported assessments of humility. And the studies that we've done, by and large, have found that there's kind of a fairly weak relationship between these two things. I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, we collected some data in classrooms, so classes that were doing team-based learning courses. So basically they were doing projects together in small groups over the course of the entire semester. And then at the end of the semester, we had them give their impressions of every other member of their group, including themselves. And we were interested, well, really at these two questions, who self-identifies as high in intellectual humility and who is being rated by others as high in intellectual humility, and seeing whether those things correlate with other attributes or different attributes. And the general pattern we found pretty consistently in these studies is that people who self-identify as high in intellectual humility tend to be the people who say that they're very open to experience, but then they tend to get identified by others as open to experiences. So that makes some sense. But the people who are rated by others, not necessarily showing that pattern, they tend to be described as being very agreeable, more sort of warm and kind, right? So it seems to be tapping into slightly different things, and I think it's getting at this idea that the way we conceptualize intellectual humility might differ when I think about myself compared to when I'm thinking about other people. And so what I want to describe for you today are a few studies we've been doing to really build on this sort of issue to explore these two main questions. Well, so what exactly are these measures predicting in terms of interpersonal behavior, and potentially are they predicting different sorts of interactions in the group context? And then looking at whether these measures predict actually the group outcomes. So does relational measures of humility actually predict groups performing and having better, more functional experiences, or do self-reported measures do it either? I'm going to be doing that, describing just two of the studies we've done, looking at this in kind of very different contexts. The first study looking at these judgments during contentious interactions, so where we're seeing disagreements. And then the second study looking at these judgments following cooperative, collaborative tasks. And then, again, in both of these, we're interested in, well, what are these measures predicting in terms of behavior, and then what are the consequences of being high or low in terms of whether the group does well or not. All right, so in the first study that we did, we recruited this community sample in Western Michigan. So we posted on Craigslist, we bought an ad in the local newspaper to try to get people to come in. We ended up with 47 little focus groups of generally 4 people. And so what we did is prior to them coming to this focus group, we would send them an online questionnaire and we wanted to assess their attitudes on a few different socio-political issues. And so these are the 4 that we ended up choosing to measure. So their attitude about genetically modified food, physician-assisted suicide, affirmative action, and the death penalty. And then what we did was form the groups based off of those attitudes. So we would pick one of these issues and have 2 people come to the group that are on one side of the issue, 2 people on the other side of the issue. And we had quite a bit of, not necessarily racial diversity, but we got quite a bit of age diversity and some definitely socioeconomic diversity in these groups. The other thing that we did before they came is we measured a number of, we used the number of the self-report measures that have gotten developed over, like I said, the last 3 years. So these are 3 that have been created. They differ slightly in terms of their conceptualization of what intellectual humility is. They tend to be fairly strongly correlated with one another, but they're slightly different. But for this study, I'm mostly going to focus on this first one, just because it's the shortest. So there's only 6 items on it, and so that lends itself really well, not just for having them rate themselves, but we can use that to have them rate everyone else fairly quickly, and that's less of an option when you have longer scales. So that allows us to really compare one-to-one relationship, the same questions being answered, but about me and also about others. So at these focus groups, what we did is we had recorded these conversations, these sort of semi-structured focus groups that lasted about 30 minutes. And so we had a researcher there who would serve as the moderator. And basically all the moderator did was pose 4 questions over the course of these 30 minutes based off of whatever the conversation was about. So it was about one of those 4 issues. And so the questions varied depending on what the topic was, but the last question was always, could you just talk about what sort of common ground you found as a group over the course of this conversation? And so we recorded these dialogues, we transcribed them, and we coded them. And so the analysis that we're interested in doing is called the lens model. The idea here is that we can look for certain behavioral cues during these dialogues, and then we can look and see how they relate to our 2 different measures of intellectual humility, right? And so the idea is we're going to, if we're over here, look at these correlations, right? So the extent to which self-reported intellectual humility correlates with particular types of behavior. Then we can go over here and see what information do groups use to form their judgments of intellectual humility. So that would be the correlations going in this direction. So we can compare and contrast these 2 to see whether they're predicting the same things or whether they're predicting quite different things. All right, so the question then is, well, what are the cues that we're looking for? What are we going to be measuring? We did a couple of different things. So one was really derived from the transcribed text. And so we used this text analysis software called Loop, which really just counts words that fall within particular categories. And so this was developed by Fernbach and his colleagues. They have a few different categories that they've sort of validated and published about. Some that, the ones that we used, we were looking sort of emotional language. So are we going to see positive emotion words getting used, negative emotion words? So the idea here, right, is that there's 620 positive emotion words in this dictionary. Each person is going to get a score based off of the percentage of total words they say that fall within that category. And then we also have developed these interesting word dictionaries for cognitive processes. I can't spend too much time on this, but you can sort of see the ones that they're getting at, that you sort of see tentative language words, certainty language words, this idea of differentiation, so are you contrasting things in your speech? So really it's a pretty broad brush in terms of measurement, but that's one idea. The other thing that we were doing was actually coding these dialogues. So I had 3 very dedicated undergraduates that watched a lot of videos and did a lot of coding over the course of a year, really. And so what this allows us to do is look at a couple of different things. So one thing we looked at was just very easily the percentage of time spent talking, so relative to the other people. We also coded interjections. So these are really just when the person starts talking while the other person is talking. And we coded these as either being positive, so saying, yeah, I agree while someone's talking, or negative, where you're interrupting to say you disagree. And then the sort of neutral ones that were sort of didn't fall in either of those things. And then last, we looked at the frequency of certain types of statements that we thought would be conceptually relevant to how those skills define intellectual humility. So we looked at the frequency of limitation statements, so times when someone said that they don't know or they need more information. what we called respect statements. So when they complimented another participant or the argument of another participant. We looked at how many inquiries they made of other people in the group, so when they asked questions or asked someone to clarify. And then we just looked at the frequency of making arguments for your position and the number of personal anecdotes you give. So, like, you know, I know a lot about this because I'm from Chicago or something like that. All right, so here's our lens model. And so the idea, we're looking at correlations. We're controlling for how similar their attitudes are to the other members in the group. So we want to control for just sort of similarity and stuff. And it's centered at the level of the group, so it's relative to the other members. But if we look at these correlations here, I don't know how well you can see this, but the ones with stars are the significant ones. What you can see is that for folks that are self-reporting as high in intellectual humility, they tend to be the people that are speaking more during the conversation, they're making more inquiries about others, and they're making more arguments. Whereas relational humility, we see a quite different pattern. People seen by others as humble are the ones making positive interjections, making very few negative interjections, and actually making fewer arguments and disclosing less. So, all right. When we look at the Luke results, so this is just the text analysis, a little less going on here. The only ones we're really seeing is similar, at least, is that both of these are related to sort of fewer negative emotion terms and a little bit more of these differentiation terms. The last thing I want to mention briefly is that following the dialogue, we had our participants just rate their experience of the group climate, so their satisfaction with the conversation, their impression of how much conflict there was, and their feelings of how engaging it was. And we just sort of look at these correlations at the level of the group. So these are looking at peer ratings, so the relational measure. What this is showing us is that for groups whose members felt that the people they were interacting with were high in humility, they tended to report greater satisfaction and less conflict. Not really much more engagement, though. We don't really see that for the self-report scales at all. You do see a little bit of a trend towards more engagement, though, for that particular item. All right, so idea here is that, you know, little relationship between these two measures. If we're just looking at these self-other correlations, pretty small. Vector correlations is really just sort of correlating the correlations on either side of that lens model, right? So not really related at all. And I think what it's demonstrating is really distinct interpersonal conceptualizations of what humility is. So self-reported seemed to be, if I'm thinking about myself, tied to my levels of engagement, inquiring about the topic, thinking about the facts and ideas. Relational humility, a little bit more thinking about others. Instead, is this person showing signs of encouragement, very positive, low negativity, more respect and focus. So it's giving, again, showing some differentiation between these two. I want to very quickly turn to the second study and think about how does this apply in the context of collaborative interaction in groups. So the second study here, we got an undergraduate sample of 240 students from Hope and Baylor. We had 60 groups of 4 people, and it was advertised as, we're interested in how your personality predicts how groups do. Same as before, we measured different takeaways for assessing intellectual humility. We also did the relational measure using the general intellectual humility scale again. And we also measured these 2 control variables previously shown to predict group performance. So this reading the mind and the eyes task is really a measure of sort of social intelligence. The advanced progressive matrix test is really a measure of fluid intelligence, general intelligence. So we want to see how do groups do controlling for these other factors of general intelligence. All right, and so we wanted participants, this is a little bit of an exploratory study. We wanted to have the participants do a lot of different group tasks. And so we drew on this work by organizational psychologist Joseph McGrath, who tried to come up with a taxonomy of different sorts of tasks that groups do collectively. You can't read this, but basically the stuff that we had folks do is 5 different conceptual types of tasks. So creativity task, negotiation task, executing, intellective task where they're solving problems together, decision making, and so on. So obviously I won't have time to go into all 5 of these things. But the main thing we're looking at, and we were interested in testing as well, to what extent would their performance be predicted by the group's intellectual humility. And we want to look at a few different things, not just sort of the group's mean, but also potentially the group's minimum. So maybe having one arrogant person pulls the group down, right? Or potentially the maximum, having one humble person pulls the group up. So you can look at the differential effects here. And so, like I said, I don't have time to look at all 5 of these. I'll just say that the ones that we were seeing the biggest impact for intellectual humility were really these 2, the creativity task and the intellective task. I'll just briefly describe the intellective one while I can. So this, to give you a sense of what it looks like, is a quantity estimation task. So you can have your participants do basically answer trivia where they have to put numbers in response to what year was Beethoven born, how many countries are in Asia. And so you can have your participants do this individually, and then we had them do it collectively. And so compute a score of really just the extent to which they were close. So a 0 score would mean you got it perfectly right, and it just sort of gets negative from that. But what we wanted to compute and look at and predict is this idea of group synergy. When I say that, it always sounds like I should be in a business school or something, but group synergy conceptually is just to what extent is the group doing better than its best individual member? So are you actually becoming more than the sum of your parts? And that's really what we're looking at, controlling for these two things. And so I'll show you kind of different patterns. So one thing to notice, right, is with the peer intellectual humility ratings, groups that felt that the members of their group were high in humility actually showed more synergy. So the mean was the significant factor. But when you look at self-ratings, mean was less important. It was actually the minimum. So having one self-described arrogant person was pulling the group down. So again, sort of different effects. And one thing I'll note is that individual scores were unrelated to their scores on these things. So it's not like intellectually humble people were just smarter and no more trivia. Really the effect was purely at the level of the group. All right, so just to sum up here, we're seeing clear difference between these two ways of understanding intellectual humility. They predict different types of behavior during contentious interaction. And they also both seem to be related to performance on certain types of tests, types of tasks. But I think probably they're influencing behavior in different ways, right? And so the thing we're working on right now, we're working on replicating this effect on intellective tasks. And again, we're going through the process of coding the behaviors to see, again, test a little bit more hypothesis of why these values are predicting things. All right, so I should stop. I'm out of time.
All right, this is such an important project, and I'm really pleased to tell you about our contribution. I'm Phil Fernbach. I'm going to be talking about work that is representative of ideas that we talk about in our book. Steve Sloman and I wrote this book, The Knowledge Illusion, and the project represents sort of development of the ideas that we talked about in that book. There's three main themes in the book. The first theme is the idea that individuals do not know very much. As individuals, we're relatively ignorant about the way that the world works. The second idea is that we tend to overestimate how well we understand things. So we don't know very much, and yet we tend to think that we understand things pretty well. In the cognitive science literature, the phenomenon is often referred to as the illusion of explanatory depth. And the third theme is the idea that knowledge is distributed across communities. So as individuals, we don't know very much, but communities tend to know a lot. Because human beings are really built for collaborative cognition, the ability to put our minds together and engage in complex goal pursuit, where individuals don't know very much, but the group knows a lot. We make the argument in the book that this feeling that we understand things comes from the fact that we participate in these communities. Because it's so natural for us to draw knowledge from outside of our heads, we often fail to recognize sort of where our own knowledge stops and where the group's knowledge begins. And that's the source of the knowledge illusion. We have been working on 3 different projects, so let me just acknowledge, this is Steve, also sort of working in parallel with me on these ideas, and this is my student Nick Light, who did a lot of work, a lot of the work that I'll talk about today. We have 3 projects that we're working on. I'm just going to talk about the first project about knowledge miscalibration and false beliefs. We also have 2 other projects that maybe we'll get a chance to talk throughout the conference about. Okay, went too far. The focus of our work has been divisive issues where there's a scientific consensus, and yet many people maintain beliefs that are counter to the scientific consensus. This is an area that I've become particularly fascinated with. It's obviously of huge societal importance. This is a picture of Jim Inhofe holding a snowball in the Senate to debate climate change. One of the areas that we have been doing a ton of work on that I'll talk specifically about today is genetically modified foods. where there's a scientific consensus about safety, and yet people really hate them. I live in Boulder, Colorado, and so it's sort of the mecca for that. This one's very timely. We're actually seeing outbreaks of measles and stuff like that, which is pretty nuts. I mean, pretty crazy. I just wanted to point out probably my most exciting and inspiring moment throughout this grant work was that I had the amazing opportunity to attend the Flat Earth Conference, which they held their international conference in Denver this year. And this is literally several hundred people getting together and talking about their true and strongly held belief that the Earth is flat. It's pretty amazing stuff. Super fascinating. Just to give a little bit of background on the science literacy, science communication literature, I'll give you sort of the 30-second view. For a long time, the ideas in that literature were governed by this idea called the deficit model, which is a very intuitive and straightforward idea. It makes a ton of sense. And the idea is simply that opposition to science, opposition to technology stems from lack of knowledge. And therefore, the goal should be to increase science literacy, and if we increase science literacy, then people will more come on board with scientific consensus issues and so on. The problem with that idea is that 20, 30, 40 years of attempts to increase science literacy with an eye to changing attitudes has not been very successful. I mean, this is why we have measles outbreaks, right? And so the literature has really shifted to talking about other kinds of ideas, sort of getting away from this idea of knowledge being the key determinant of attitudes in this domain. One of the other big ideas that's pretty popular these days is the idea of cultural cognition. This is an idea that's been promoted by people like Dan Kahan and others. And the idea is that people's attitudes about these issues don't really stem from their knowledge, but instead come from their communities. They're taken directly from the knowledge communities with which they affiliate. What we're adding to this debate is bringing in the idea of intellectual humility and false beliefs. The idea that it might not just be about knowledge, but about the idea that extreme views sometimes stem from miscalibration, people thinking that they know more than they do. And if that's the case, then merely trying to educate people is probably not going to be very successful. Because if I already feel like I understand the issue, I'm not going to be very open to listening to what you have to say. First study I'm going to show you looks at knowledge calibration in the domain of genetically modified foods. So this is a survey where we did three things. We measured extremity of opposition, so how strongly are they opposed to the scientific consensus on genetically modified foods. We measure that in a couple different ways, with concern and opposition. And then objective knowledge, how much do they actually know? In all of our studies, we look both at general science literacy, but we also have subscales that measure more specific things. So in this case, we have a genetic subscale. It ends up being the case that the general science literacy and the subscales always behave in exactly the same way, so it doesn't really matter how you measure it. And then finally, subjective knowledge. How much do people think that they know about genetically modified foods? And we adapt the measures from work by, the classic work on the illusion of explanatory depth by Rosenblatt and Kyle. Just to give you a sense here, this clicker doesn't work very well. Okay, these are the kind of questions that we ask in the science literacy quiz. This is a pretty standard approach to measuring science literacy. We have true-false questions. We measure these on a scale rather than in a binary way, but that ends up not really mattering either, so don't worry too much about that. But there are questions like this, true-false, where you're going to get points based on being correct. And then we have our measure of subjective understanding. How well do you feel like you understand the issue? And what we're trying to get in is people's understanding of how genetic engineering technology works. Don't feel it's necessary to read all of the text here, but basically what we're doing is explaining to people how to use the scale so that people know how to use it. And we're giving people examples of what different levels of understanding would be so that they can rate themselves appropriately. Just to quickly show you, this is the distribution of how people feel about genetically modified foods, and they really hate them. This is a very common kind of result. The other thing that I want to point out, because it's going to be important later, is that genetically modified foods, there's no effect of political orientation at all. We find this across all of our studies, and this is also known in the literature. This is surprising to a lot of people. They think it's a liberal issue, but it's actually not. And here is the main result of the study, and it's quite a striking result, I think. As extremity of opposition increases, science literacy goes down, and genetics literacy goes down, and that makes a lot of sense, I think. That's the sort of classic deficit model idea. If you learn more about the science, maybe you come more in line with the consensus. But now if we look at subjective knowledge, the pattern is exactly in the opposite direction. So those who are more extreme think that they understand the issue better. And when we put these two things together, the result is kind of striking. The extremists know the least, but think that they know the most, which is a lack of intellectual humility, I think. One other result here that I want to show you real quick, if the clicker will click. This is, I'm looking at, this is an interaction model looking at the relationship between science literacy and subjective knowledge at different levels of extremity. And what we see is if you're a moderate, you're fairly well calibrated. So you know what you know. If you say you know more, then you actually know more. But that pattern completely goes away as you become more extreme. This is actually, I think, a nice demonstration of David's work, of something you could think of as a kind of Dunning-Kruger effect. So the extremists are not very well calibrated. They don't know what they know. We have in the paper some data that was collected in a separate study by a different group in the United States, France, and Germany. And I'll just quickly go through this and tell you that more or less we get the same results in those three countries. Okay. What we also looked at is, the next thing we looked at is, come on, you can do it, is looking at gene therapy. So gene therapy is a medical application of genetic engineering technology. People tend to be more accepting of gene therapy than of genetically modified foods. So we wanted to know, is this something that's specific to some stuff you eat, or so on. And we find exactly the same pattern for gene therapy. So the results are the same between between GMOs and gene therapy, genetically modified foods. Okay, now the story gets a little more interesting, a little more nuanced. We also looked at climate change in this study, and here we find no effect. So this, first of all, is opposition to the consensus on climate change. Here, it's less of a non-consensus issue. More people are in line with the consensus than with GMOs, but still there's a significant number who do not believe in human caused climate change. And in this case, there's a very strong effect of political orientation, so this is a much more of a conservative issue. Here's the result, no result. So with climate change, we sometimes across studies get a weak decrease in objective knowledge with extremity. That sort of differs across studies a little bit, but it's always weak. Okay, so sometimes it's almost there. It's you know just barely significant and so on, but it's much weaker. And on the subjective knowledge side, also no effect here. And what we attribute that to is the political polarization of the issue. So what it seems like is happening is that when an issue is highly polarized, those effects of polarization can kind of crowd out the knowledge effects that we observe. And we provide some evidence in the paper looking at interactions with political affiliation and so on. So the next question that we asked is, man, this thing really does not work, is how general is this effect? So we looked across 7 different issues. We tried to think of just about every issue we could come up with where there's a relatively strong scientific consensus. And we ran a similar study across these different issues. And we also developed this larger science literacy scale, which has domain subscales for all the different issues we looked at. And we also looked at religious and political affiliation to look at the polarization of the issues to see if that moderates the size of the effect. Yeah, this thing is like getting worse. Okay, here are the issues that we looked at. We looked at climate change, genetically modified food, vaccination, nuclear power, homeopathic medicine, evolution, and the Big Bang. These last 2 are kind of interesting because people often hold the counter-scientific consensus view on the basis of religious beliefs. So that's why we collected the religious polarization idea. here's the overall result collapsing across all issues. We get a strong replication of the effect we found for genetically modified food. Overall, as extremity of opposition to the consensus goes up, objective knowledge goes down, subjective knowledge goes up. That's a very strong effect. But it gets a little more interesting when we look across issues, because not all issues behave the same way. If we look at the top here, this is objective knowledge: Big Bang, climate change, evolution, genetically modified foods, homeopathy, nuclear technology, and vaccination. What we see is that generally the effect on objective knowledge is very consistent, so it's kind of deficit model idea, that's very consistent. But what we find is that the effect on subjective actually depends on the issue quite a bit. And I like to sort of divide the plot here. These issues, which I think of as the quote-unquote secular issues, all show the same effect that we found for genetically modified foods. But when we look over here at Big Bang, evolution, and interestingly climate change, which is highly polarized but along political grounds, you actually find slight reversals where it goes in the other direction. The way to interpret that is that if I believe in that the Big Bang didn't happen, I don't say that I understand the physics. I acknowledge that actually, no, my belief is based on my religion, and I'm not actually claiming more knowledge. So there's a lot more interesting results in this study that I won't get into today. But I'll show you one more thing, which is, this is the political polarization of the issues. I was shocked by this one, actually. Higher numbers mean more conservative, and homeopathy, I was sure was going to go in the other direction. That's, again, living in Boulder, but it's actually a more conservative issue. Most of the counter-scientific views are conservative in nature, and then religious polarization, pretty confounded with political polarization as well. Let me just show you real quick one result, which is an interaction model, looking across the different issues in terms of their degree of polarization. And this is looking at effective extremity on subjective knowledge. That's where we find interactions. So it's actually not on objective knowledge. Regardless of how polarized the issue is, everybody goes down in their objective knowledge with extremity. But subjective knowledge does not behave in that way. For the more polarized issues, that's where you get the moderation. So I think it's actually a pretty interesting pattern of results. Okay, I've got a few minutes left. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get into some of the follow-up work that we've done, going much more deep into the psychology of opposition to genetically modified foods. The idea is that we have this interesting dynamic about the nature of the way that knowledge contributes to people's attitudes. It's not so simple that we can just educate our way out of the problem. And the kind of stuff that they try in the literature, like just appealing to the scientific consensus, doesn't work very well. Presumably because people say, like, you know, I kind of already understand this issue, I don't need to listen to you. So what our idea, the high-level idea of what we're trying to do in this work is to understand the psychology of why people hold these counter consensus views, and with an eye to designing more targeted interventions that targets the psychology more directly. So we started thinking about what are the potential things that people actually think that they know, the extremists. What do they think that they know? Right? They have this high subjective knowledge. And we considered three possibilities. One is that it's nothing, that the attitude is just taken from the community. That's sort of the cultural cognition view. Another thing that we thought about was the idea of false beliefs, so that people have these implicit mental models about the way that the technology works that makes them uncomfortable with it. That's going to end up being a very important part of it. And then the other one that we looked at is this idea of absolute moral opposition, where people say, it's not really about my concerns about the consequences, but I just think this is wrong fundamentally. And we think that this idea of absolute moral opposition, we call it values-based opposition, is associated also with naturalness concerns. You think this stuff is weird, it's unnatural, it's against the natural order, it's against God, and so on. I just want to show you this because this is a pretty interesting result from an early study, got us thinking about false beliefs. We asked people whether this is true. A gene inserted into a food can migrate into the genetic code of humans who consume the food. This is whether people thought that was true or false. And if you think it's true, you really hate GM, which makes a lot of sense. It's not true, okay? But if you think it's true, it makes this stuff seem really scary. So this blue line makes a lot of sense. But then if we looked at self-rated knowledge, of the GM food, it actually goes in the other way. So those guys who have that belief think they understand it, but actually it's based on this false belief. So we started thinking that false beliefs might be really important here. I'll just quickly show you what we did in the study. I'm gonna shoot through a few slides really quick to give you guys sort of the 35,000 foot view. We collected open-ended responses on why people are opposed, and then collected a bunch of psychological correlates to try to sort of build up a psychological profile of people who hold different reasons for opposition. By far and away, in genetically modified foods, people fear bodily harm based on these kind of false mental models of how it works. They think they're going to get sick, get cancer, be poisoned, and so on. There is also this absolutism, absolute moral opposition is a fairly significant group, and then some other things like fear of the unknown, social, political concerns, environmental harm, and so on. The reason I think that these two groups, the bodily harm and the unnatural, are so important is because those are the extremists. So they have the highest extremity, and by the way, they also have low science literacy, and they have high subjective knowledge. So this is sort of a pseudo-replication of what we found before. Those extreme people tend to be the ones that have the low objective, high subjective. They tend to have these two types of concerns, either bodily harm concerns or this more absolute moral opposition. And I'm going to finish just by telling you this work is sort of ongoing. We designed interventions which is meant to target those groups. And so we have three things we do. So one is appeal to scientific consensus. That's sort of the status quo. That's usually what's attempted. Doesn't work very well. And then what we did was design a mechanism explanation. And the idea would be that if I have bodily harm concerns, I feel like this is going to make me sick and it's based on a false belief, then I can explain the mechanism to you and teach you that that's actually what you believe is not possible. And that the idea is that could counteract that idea. And then for the people who have absolute moral opposition, we designed this naturalness intervention, which draws an analogy between genetic modification and crossbreeding, which has been done for thousands of years and so on, makes people maybe realize that this isn't so weird, not so unnatural. Now, one of the challenges we're running into is that these two groups, the group who has the absolute moral opposition, the group who has the bodily harm concerns, they overlap quite a bit, more so than we were hoping. They're not as cleanly separable. So the idea of the study, the rationale makes perfect sense, I think, is that we should get differential effectiveness of this intervention across groups. So far, we've found some weak evidence for that, but we're still working on it. So I think my time is up, and I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Since I've been holding up cards asking the panelists to stop speaking, I'm pretty sure none of them think I'm humble. But now I get to ask the audience for your opinion, so maybe I'll ameliorate my standing a little bit with you. So we have about 30 minutes, fascinating papers, lots of rich material, and I can take a cue. We'll start with Heather.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to all of you so much for your projects. This is super interesting, and thanks for being here to present. So my question's actually for Ben, or is it Benjamin? Or
Ben's good.
Ben, okay. So Ben, I had a question about the limitations statement specifically. So you were, right, okay. So question about the limitation statements, and you said at the beginning of your talk that you were looking just at the Leary scale, or at least the stuff you were presenting today was about the Leary scale.
Right.
So I was wondering whether you saw, if you looked at all three of those scales, the limitation zoning, the crumb race, and Leary, on the limitation statements, and whether any of those scales got closer to other report.
Yeah. None of them were consistent with the other report.
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, the missing the one that was the same would presumably be, because you're answering the same question about yourself, that sort of methodologically you would expect more similarity. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of correlations there, so I can't tell you offhand some of the specifics, but the general tendency was the same. Sort of the quantity of the correlations would go up or down. But yeah, that's the general pattern.
Thank you. We have Walter.
I wanted to expand on a point that Alessandra made at the very beginning, which is that people ask me to rate the humility of somebody else, I usually don't know what to do. Because most of my friends, at least, are humble about some things, but not about others. And when you ask a general humility scale, it seems to me that's going to make you subject to massive framing effects. You know, if I'm thinking about golf, I'm going to think my friend, I'm not going to name him, is not humble, you know, but if I'm thinking about music, he's going to be humble. And so what are you thinking about at the moment will just radically change what you do if you ask about humility in general. So I guess I'm wondering, you know, I guess this is a general question for all of you, but to what extent do you think results on humility are going to be subject to framing effects because people are thinking of different types of humility on particular topics?
Yeah, I mean, at least some of us are psychologists, so I mean, we're interested in mistakes just as much as accuracy. So people are affected by. I mean, and I think you're right, that the context of the evaluation is going to matter. I mean, at least in my studies, like it would be odd. You're right in the abstract of rating humility. We're generally doing it after a particular interaction that we want to be the framing of that particular judgment. But yeah, so I mean, at least in the experimental methodology, the goal, right, is to give everyone the same frame and of a conversation or a task or the context in which you're collecting it.
I guess in defense of the people who design the individual difference scales, they're often trying to aim at a general framing so that they try to avoid having people focus on particular topic areas. But I guess it's just an empirical question, the extent to which people are successful at doing that. How often do they end up tapping in their own mental short-term memory particular topics or biases that end up maybe not predicting intellectual humility in some domains as well as others. But this is a common issue we have with all individual differences measures that are designed.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that again that I mean, a classic issue is that personality is not great at predicting specific instances of a behavior, but it's good in the aggregates, and that's sort of the solution between social and personality psychology that was reached at some point. But yeah, so I mean, you know, so we're sort of expecting smaller correlations on the smaller side for these particular tasks, but yeah, I mean, if you could do something longitudinally, looking at lots of conversations between people, you'd expect the relationship to go up.
Can I make a comment in the
No, go ahead.
I'm not a psychologist, but one of the things that struck me and I think speaks to this is the similarities between some of the things Benjamin arrived at and some of the things we arrived at. Because Greg and I were talking and we had the same problem, though. We had no significant correlation with the self-report measure with our measures, which you can call interaction or humility if you want. I mean, we weren't using that vocabulary. And so one way in which I frame what we were doing here is to sort of think of it as arrogant behavior about that topic in interaction with that group. And we're looking at intellectual humility, not humility per se. And so the view is that what we are trying to do is to see whether people behave arrogantly about that topic in debate. And of course, we would have, and that's what we're hoping to get funded, is to then do it with other topics of debate and see whether we get similar effects. So I agree with you, there is an issue. But my focus was on whether people behave arrogantly, as opposed to whether they are arrogant, if you see what I mean, in that context.
So I've got a nice list here. I've got you. So I've got Robert. Robert now. Yeah.
This is a question for Philip. And I guess it starts with just a query about some of the empirical stuff with respect to the anti-vaxxers.
Mm-hmm. Whoa.
Trying not to have that conversation. I thought that what was peculiar about the anti-vaxxers is that they actually had a good understanding of some of the facts about the vaccines that outstrips the understanding of your average person who vaccinates their child.
Yeah.
So first question is that true?
I thought that might be true before we started the work. I actually received like a 10,000 word email from an anti-vaxxer once. It had a lot of information, incorrect information, of course, but a lot of information. But in the aggregate, what we find is that no. I mean, I think we hear from those voices a lot, but your sort of average person has a lower knowledge, actually, lower scientific knowledge. Now, do they have false beliefs? Presumably. So do they know things that other people don't know that happen to be wrong? Probably, but we actually haven't done that study with the vaccination.
Okay, just a quick follow-up then. So is the data that you have, does it suggest that, suggests that the more extreme you go, the more false beliefs you have, and the higher you estimate your knowledge. But does it suggest anything about, do the people have moderate beliefs about these issues tend to have good information, or do they, because it seems like the result is consistent with the moderates still not understanding very much.
No, yeah, I agree completely. I mean, what we find when we ask people to try to elaborate these kinds of things is people know next to nothing. Everybody knows next to nothing. So Michael Ranney's done a lot of the work on global warming, for instance, and he's done a lot of really interesting work. Actually, he's modeled their sort of mechanism interventions on what he's been doing. And he went to a park in San Diego or something and asked 300 people to explain the mechanism of global warming, like zero. The answer was zero, that people could do it. So no, it's not like the moderates have a lot of knowledge. They have relatively higher science literacy, but you see the types of questions that are in that scale. Does the Earth revolve around the sun, and so on. People do not know a lot. That's one of the major themes of our book. Is that individuals don't know a lot about the way that the world works, especially when it comes to these kind of scientific issues.
And the literacy model seems to presume that the more information you have, the more moderate you are, but it doesn't seem that the data find that out, right?
That's the problem, right? Like that is the compelling sort of intuitive idea that people have been promoting since the 1970s with very little success, hence measles outbreaks and flat earth societies and so on.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up for Philip. What percentage of the U.S. population could be described as scientifically literate?
I never think about binary things. It's obviously it's a continuum, so it depends what you mean by that. I would say probably like 0%. The problem with science literacy measurements is they're these true-false sort of general knowledge questions. It's a pretty rough proxy for actually understanding how science works and really deeply understanding stuff. I can tell you that the Earth revolves around the sun, but I can't actually probably justify that belief, and I can't tell you anything else about orbital mechanics and so on and so forth. So am I science literate just because I can't answer that question? That's an open question. It just depends where you draw the line.
Yeah, but I'll pick up with that actually. I liked all the presentations. I like towards the end I really liked where you were going with the, well, what do we do about this and what kind of interventions can we make, which was in your second project. The thing that I wasn't getting here, and it might relate to that discussion we just had here, is about you kind of make an intervention in different ways, but it's about also who the messenger is here. And so much of this is about trust and heuristics. So I don't mind that much that people don't know so much about science, but do they know who to trust about it?
I agree completely.
And I didn't see that in your work. So when you're trying to make these interventions and are trying to explain to people in different ways, surely it will matter whether or not you are someone coming from a trusted proxy.
Yes, I agree.
And so I just wonder how that plays into what you're doing, because that seems to me to, particularly I'm from political science, that seems to be really critical in terms of the way that people see the world.
Yeah, I feel like because I've been talking a bunch, maybe I should open it up. And these guys are the experts on group stuff. If you have something to add. Words in the offer. I just want to make sure it's not just.
I just wondered. Sorry, I'm being honest with you. But in your intervention, how are you saying who? When you're explaining...
I see.
Are you saying,
Specifically what we do is, I agree with you. First of all, I agree with you completely. We're not trying to educate people with an eye to like making everyone an expert.
Yeah.
In the end, what you're going to have to do is take the word of the expert that you trust. And that's going to determine your opinion. And across different knowledge communities, people trust different experts, and that's the major problem. And then if I come to somebody who doesn't believe in vaccination and say, well, scientists believe that X is the case, it's very easy for them to just ignore that information because they say, oh, my guy says something different, right? In our studies, we don't actually try to manipulate or orient on that at all. We just come from a very sort of straightforward approach, which says, we're going to give you some information here. We actually thought about giving people some sort of elaboration at the beginning to try to lower their defenses a little bit, because if they feel like they're being lectured to, we might get a sort of a backlash effect and so on. So we thought about integrating that and saying, look, we're not trying to really change your mind, we're just trying to give you information, but we ended up not doing that. And actually the effects that we're getting are really big on overall reduction, which I was shocked by, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure it's because subjects are just being kind of cooperative and so on. But the problem we're not having is not getting effects. So I think what we're doing is working okay on that dimension. I'm not sure if you guys have anything to add on that.
I mean, I think it's an interesting issue when you think about attitude functions and the knowledge function, because a lot of work on persuasion and social psychology for a long time has suggested that if you start relying on sources, then you're relying on heuristic shortcuts that circumvent thinking in detail about the evidence. And so thinking in detail about the evidence is kind of the epitome of what we would think is a knowledge function. But there are also cases when an issue is quite difficult and intractable, and it seems rational to be thinking about expertise and trust in expertise, and that actually is a valid pursuit of knowledge. But I mean, as social psychologists, we do these experiments and think, well, there are different degrees. Perhaps one route is happening this way, another route is happening this way. But then when it comes to functionality and thinking, well, what are we trying to achieve through trust in others? I think it's a deeper question that I don't think has been solved yet. So these are fun studies to do, in part because when we look at the conversational dynamics, we're trying to unpick the extent to which we think there is a sincere effort to try to get closer to truth versus not. And it's not necessarily as simple as are they looking at the arguments versus are they looking at the person who says it.
It's about trying to judge their intellectual humility seems to be about as much judging people's judgments about the people who are giving them information and they're relying on, which we don't capture in these.
True, and perhaps arrogance is a kind of presumptiveness
Yeah.
that refuses to perhaps question the credibility about another person.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the argument we make in the book about is that people feel like they understand by virtues of others' understanding. So there's an interesting interaction between trust and expertise and your own individual intellectual arrogance.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a nice long list here.
Lonnie.
Yeah, sorry, tell me your name.
Lonnie.
Lonnie, hi. I couldn't read your card.
Yeah, that's thanks. Yeah, so I was just wanting to ask a question for Alessandra and Greg about, I think this is maybe methodological question that you might have answered but I somewhat missed, about the linguistic framework and whether, how you developed that linguistic framework with the tests for humility and arrogance and civility. Was that the original conceptions of humility, arrogance, civility are being like plugged in by the self-report measures, and then the dialogue is happening, and then you're getting the language, it's the expressions, and then after that point the relational or the other report measure is being based on that dialogue or discussion. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Shall I?
So,
Yeah, you go.
perhaps start if you because I think some of the details, I did go very quickly over it, so I think it sounds like there may have been some confusion about the procedure. The individual difference measures were completely separate from the coding of the dialogue.
Right.
So we didn't plug in anything to do with those in terms of coding for the dialogue. What we did was apply the theoretical framework that Alessandra has developed to thinking about intellectual humility and then coding the dialogue. So Chris Heffer and colleagues at Cardiff then went and through the dialogues with that framework in mind, coded different aspects of the conversation. Then we looked at them again and said, okay, now how would we combine these into an intellectual humility score? And I think that's where Alessandra's more familiar with the Cardiff.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, we didn't go into details, but like Benjamin, we used Elan, right? So the thought was this. We video recorded all the debate. We put them into this software, Elan, and then we transcribed everything. Chris Heffer had developed a linguistic framework that was based on 3 dimensions. One was dominance. And dominance we measured by measuring floor space, how often the person talked. And the other thing, which we were planning to do, and is part of the framework, but proved quite difficult to code, sorry, are non-TRP interruptions. So Benjamin was talking about interjections. So when somebody speaks and the other person interjects, but you can interject in a transition relevant place, a place where it's normal for the other person, or in a non-transitional relevant place. And what we were interested in for dominance wasn't all interjections, but only those that happen in non-transitional relevant places. So the attempt there was to find a way of reintroducing the notion of an interruption in conversational analysis. Apparently, conversational analysis abandon the notion of an interruption because it's not very clear what the difference is between an interjection that is an interruption and an interjection that isn't an interruption. And one of the things we were trying to do is reintroduce a new notion of what we would like to call an interruption, but they call a non-transition relevant place interjection, in order to then understand arrogance in terms of, how disruptive the interjection was. That's the bit that we started, but we haven't been able to fully code because it's proved quite difficult. The other 2 dimensions were engagement. And engagement basically is how much you engage with the other person. And then conviction, which I tend to think in terms of, how certain are you of your views. So then the idea was, once you've got that linguistic frameworks and you have the video transcription, so not just what is being said, but also the nods and so on and so forth. The head nods are very important for engagement, for instance. Then you can code the behaviors and score the behaviors. Right? And then the view was that with those scores, we would call certain range of scores arrogant behavior and some ranges humble behavior, depending on how you measured in the 3 dimensions, dominance, engagement, and conviction. So that was the thought, right? That you would have the individual differences measures of various sorts. And then independently, you would have the coding of it. Did I explain it okay?
I think so.
Yeah. And independently, you would have the measures of the linguistic behavior.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's
I think we have this gentleman here, and then
My name's Jonathan Garlick. I'm from Tufts University. I have a question for you, Philip. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. So my question is about how do you establish that a scientific consensus actually exists?
Yeah.
What I mean by that is there's a gap between the degree of scientific consensus that's understood by the public and the amount of scientific consensus that actually exists between scientists.
Right.
So, for example, the example you gave of GMOs, the scientists I hang out with feel that there are not enough intergenerational studies. We haven't done enough animal studies. So there's actually more uncertainty than uncertainty in that scientific community.
Yeah.
I do gene therapy research in my own lab. I would never find that degree of disagreement in my scientific community about harm versus health. Everybody thinks we're going to help somebody. So I guess the question is, since scientific consensus seems to be a moving target, how do you frame what a scientific consensus is?
Yeah, I agree. It's a challenging issue. So the simple answer is that we sort of picked issues where we find a statement by, say, the AAAS or some other group like that states a consensus. And those are kind of the issues. And across issues, some of them are a little weaker than others. But the true answer is that I'm no expert on gene therapy or genetic engineering technology or climate change or anything. And so we're just more interested in the psychology of people who have those views, regardless of what the actual truth of the science is. And typically, like our people who oppose the consensus on GMOs, their reason for opposition is not something that is controversial at all. It's, tends to be like pretty straightforwardly incorrect beliefs and so on. So I try to avoid, because I'm trying to, especially when you do work on intellectual humility, it's upfront about the fact that, look, I don't know anything about GMOs. I spent a few days looking at it so I can design interventions and so on, but I don't presume to be the expert there.
Should we now be assessed to whether we believe you?
Okay, so I have 4 people in the queue and only 6 minutes, so I'm going to take 2 questions and then go to our panelists. The gentleman.
Okay, I'll try to ask 2 questions really quickly, a little bit overarching theme. A great talk, so I have to quibble with how some of the major ideas have been measured. Phil, how do you know that people actually believe what they're saying? There's a tremendous controversy in political science when people endorse politically polarized beliefs, whether they actually believe them. And sometimes what can happen is that people say and they know full well what the scientists say. And that usually happens in evolutionary work, for example. That's example number 1. Example number 2 is I actually have to admit a little bit of a quandary, because often I find humility is often not what people do, it's what people don't do. It's the argument they don't make. It's the sentence they don't say. It's a question I'm not asking. And so how can other people actually be aware in measurements of behavior whether or not a person is actually being humble? After all those people talking so much are probably holding themselves in the most. And so they may very well be right when they say they're most humble. So I just leave that open for anybody who wants to take either of those quibbles.
Yeah, I'll say on the...
We're going to hold off and take another question.
Oh, we're just going to let that question hang in the air.
Just for 3 minutes while the other person asks their question.
Oh, okay.
And I have you, Lauren.
Okay. Yeah, it was a follow-up to the question about trust. And when you're talking about, how do you increase knowledge of people, and if they don't trust in the experts, right? I mean, I think we are agreed that simply having the experts stand up there and say, you should trust me because here are my credentials and my degrees and all the books I've written isn't going to work. So I guess I was interested in whether you're exploring other ways to reduce fear, which I also see sort of is the opposite, polar opposite of trust here, right? And so many of the studies you did, I think, show that people react out of fear, right? I don't want my body hurt, I don't want my baby hurt, etc. And so I guess my question is, how can we think about, or how have you thought about ways to improve the trust factor for experts without going directly the knowledge route, if that makes sense?
You mean getting people to trust scientists? So
right. And because if I don't trust scientists and you get up there and they show me their credentials, I'm not going to trust them anymore, right? Because that's again knowledge. So how do you go?
Yeah, we have not tried to push on that lever.
Okay.
It's an interesting possibility.
Because I've read your book, which was really fascinating. I can see in sort of micro issues getting people to change their mind. I think I know how a toilet works, et cetera, and I try to explain that I don't that. But when it comes to overall arching these problems that people really have deep-seated fears about, it seems to me that I don't know if you can have them practice explaining something. If that, the example that you've used in your book, whether that would work, it seems to me we have to sort of address the issue of trust, but not through knowledge. So
I think you're right that it's a huge barrier. Like, for instance, when we looked at the climate change issue, we don't get these effects because the issue is so polarized. And so there might be other levers that we need to push on for sure by intervening on sort of the network itself and try to figure out how to. So yeah, I don't have an answer for you. I mean, this is the $64,000 question. I mean, this is kind of what we're all gathered here, right, to try to figure that out.
Okay. Any other comments from the panelists? Okay. Sorry?
David's question. Yeah. David just got to ask a question, but didn't get an answer.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, with regard to the second question about what we don't know about what is going on in their heads and how we hold it back, I agree. That's how are we going to solve that? There are probably different ways, but we can only code what we see, not what we don't see. And personally, I think there will always be some interpersonal discrepancy because of the the extent to which people will share different bodies of knowledge. I mean, I think methodologically, we could probably get around it to some extent by knowing more about the backgrounds of individuals, so that if they have high bodies of knowledge and they're holding back, perhaps we can detect that to some degree, and then we would be able to measure humility indirectly that way. But right now, I think we're at the stage of just trying to figure out what the overt manifestations are and less of what the hidden ones.
Well, this is where we disagree, because the overt may be the covert, and it is a unique challenge, you're right.
Well, yeah, I think I'm not sure your disagreement there, because the thing, when I say overt, I'm thinking there are verbal manifestations that are quite clear. The ones they don't say, as what I'm considering covert, are based on knowledge they have access to that other people don't have access to. If we get access to that, then it's no longer covert, it's overt. Then we have a sense in which they're holding back.
Could I make a comment there? There is also, I mean, conceptually there is also an issue, because I don't think of humility as a virtue of continence. So Paul is the expert and I disagree. So I don't think that people who hold back, right, are necessarily humble. You know, maybe they are reformed, arrogant people. But, I don't think that's, I mean, but then it could become just semantics, right? So
12-step program.
But it's not clear to me that people who have developed the ability to stop themselves from talking all over other people are the kind of people I would call humble. But it could be just a semantic dispute.
Do we have 1 minute and I can address the first question?
Yeah.
David? So we're looking at the effects on extremity of counter-scientific attitudes, right? And you're saying, how do we know that people believe what they're saying? I mean, all that has to be true is that there's some relationship between the strength of that judgment and their likelihood of engaging in certain kinds of actions, right? And I think that's highly likely to be the case. People who say that they're more extremely opposed to GM foods are more likely to oppose them in practice and so on. And so I didn't, yeah.
That may not be based on false belief, is then the argument.
Say again?
Then it's not based on false belief is just a phenomenon. By the way, I believe you,
Yeah.
but there's a hurdle there.
Okay, we should talk more.
We'll talk more.
Do we have time? Couple minutes? You're the next question. Put you in a precarious position. Okay, thank you very much to our panel.